When creating my horror trailer, one of my initial aims was to ensure that my trailer conformed to the conventions of the horror genre. In order to ensure that I was successful in doing this, when playing my horror trailer, I took many factors into account. The first factor that I took into account when planning my horror trailer was the location. For my location, I used a local wood, which I believe was an excellent location for a horror film. The woods provided plenty of low-key light, which helped my trailer to achieve an eerie atmosphere. Low-key lighting is a convention of the horror genre and features frequently in many horror films, as it establishes a sense of hopelessness and disorientates the audience, as the audience is unable to see everything that is in shot. When analysing my 3 trailers before creating my horror trailer, I took inspiration from many of the shots, effects and costumes that I saw within the 3 trailers. The 3 trailers that I analysed were The Hills of Eyes, Hostel and The Dark Knight, an action film. Whilst playing my horror trailer, I took many of the techniques that I had seen used in these trailers into consideration. For example, the second factor that I took into account when creating my horror trailer was camera shots. Frequently in horror films, camera shots are used to convey the power struggle between the antagonist and the protagonist through the use of high and low angle camera shots. In my trailer, I tried to incorporate this technique as I believe that it would put a clear emphasis on the power struggle between the 2 entities. As you can see in the shot behind me, we have a high angle shot of the protagonist falling over, whilst comparatively, here we have a low angle shot of the antagonist running through the woods. The high angle shot connotes that the protagonist is in a position of weakness, i.e. the fact that he's just fallen over, and the low angle shot of the antagonist connotes that they are in a position of power, as they are in the woods, which is familiar territory for them. For these shots, I took inspiration from The Dark Knight, one of my 3 trailers that I analysed, as frequently high and low angle shots are used to convey the Joker's dominance over the Batman, for example, in the shot behind me. What is more, when creating my horror trailer, I tried to apply many different filming techniques. As I was unable to gain access to tracking equipment for my trailer, I used a tripod to try to create panning effects in my trailer. I also aimed to represent the horror genre through the type of camera shots that I featured in my horror trailer. For example, in this point of view shot behind me, point of view shots such as these feature frequently in horror films, as they allow the audience to see through the eyes of the antagonist without the audience seeing the antagonist's face. When creating my horror trailer, I also wanted to ensure that my typography was representative of the horror genre. For this, I took inspiration from Hostel, one of the horror trailers that I analysed. In the Hostel trailer, as the action on screen intensifies, the typography on screen jumps out, shocking the audience, as you can see in the shots behind me. For my horror trailer, I used a similar effect, as you can see. As the trailer progresses and the narrative develops, the text changes from calm to dramatic. I use this technique as I believe that it adds suspense to the trailer and captures the audience's attention. Music also played an integral role in my horror trailer, in building suspense, and when deciding what soundtrack to use, I took inspiration from The Hills of Eyes, one of the 3 trailers that I analysed, as I separated my soundtrack into 2 sections. Firstly, we have an eerie forest ambient soundtrack, which plays through the first half of the trailer. And then in the second half, the music suddenly shifts to a fast-paced orchestral soundtrack. This conforms to the conventions of the horror genre, as frequently, this 2 soundtrack technique is used to disorientate the audience and to build tension. The typography used in my theatrical trailer represents the film's narrative, as the typography is meant to represent tree branches. I use this font as I believe that it represents the woods where my film is set, and the branches featured within the typography look somewhat like a hand, for example here, which links to the ghostly entity in my horror trailer, who manipulates the woods to their will to capture their victims. My poster and magazine cover were also extremely important when undertaking my practical project, as I wanted them to conform to the conventions of the horror genre. I used a variety of techniques that I had seen in similar posters and magazine covers to achieve this effect. Firstly, with my theatrical poster, I wanted to create a poster that would conform to many of the conventions of the horror genre. To do this, I took many things into consideration, including low-key lighting, the creation of enigmas, and an eerie atmosphere. To go about achieving these things in my poster, I researched other theatrical posters which I believed achieved these things. The poster that I took much of my inspiration from was hollow, as you can see behind me. Using the hollow poster for inspiration, I went about creating my horror poster. Conventionally, the titles for film posters are usually positioned at the bottom of the poster in the centre. However, I challenged this convention by positioning my poster's title at the bottom right of my poster. I took inspiration from the Hollow poster and the theatrical poster for Moon, as I believe that by positioning my poster's title at the bottom right of my poster, it attracts the audience to the title and to the dead body that lies adjacent to it. When trying to devise a tagline for my horror trailer, I toyed with many different ideas before coming to a decision. I chose to use the tagline, "Some things are better left untouched." This is a reference to the amulet which also features in my poster, which the protagonist stumbles upon in the woods, and how its discovery leads to a battle for survival between the protagonist and the antagonist. I wanted to ensure my tagline conformed to the conventions of horror film posters, and to ensure this, I placed the tagline above the film's title, as frequently in horror film posters, such as the poster for Apparition behind me. This is where it normally appears. I took many aspects into consideration when designing my horror poster, so that it would have a maximum appeal to my target audience. In many respects, other than the positioning of the title and the fact that I used a dead body on the front cover rather than either the antagonist or the protagonist, my poster conforms to the conventions of the horror genre. For example, in my poster, low-key lighting is used, which is synonymous with the horror genre, as frequently low-key lighting is used to create tension and to build suspense. Another way in which my poster conforms to the conventions of the horror genre is that many enigmas are posed in the theatrical poster. Instead of using a picture of the antagonist or protagonist in my poster, I decided to use a dead body with an amulet in their hand, as these have incredibly significant roles in my horror trailer. I believe that the use of the amulet and the dead body presents the audience with many enigmas, such as how did they die and what significance does the amulet have. It is hoped that these enigmas will persuade the audience to view my film, as they may be compelled to find out answers to the questions that my theatrical trailer has posed. Another way in which my poster conforms to the conventions of the horror genre is that I try to display the power balance between forces of good and evil, which are frequently conveyed in horror posters. I was able to achieve this by using a low-angle shot. This shot conveys the woods as a powerful dominant force and the victim as weak. What is more, the prison bar effect created by the trees highlights the idea that those who are in the woods and being pursued by the antagonist, otherwise known as the ghostly entity, are trapped. For my magazine front cover, I chose to create a front cover for the Empire magazine. When creating my magazine front cover for my horror trailer, I took many factors into account, including lighting, typography, and the conventions of a magazine cover. Firstly, when designing my magazine cover, I looked for inspiration from previous issues of Empire magazine. I found inspiration in issues such as The Hobbit and X-Men First Class. For my magazine front cover, I decided to use an image of the protagonist kneeling down in the woods. I wanted to use the woods in my magazine front cover, as I wanted to have a common link between both my magazine front cover and my horror poster. And this use of the woods in the background will allow audience members to establish a link between both the magazine front cover and the theatrical poster. What is more, I used the lighter image of the protagonist against the dark background of the woods. I used this effect as I wanted to portray the protagonist as a force of good, hence the light colours, and the woods as evil, hence the dark colours. As mentioned earlier, I took inspirations from previous issues of Empire magazine. When deciding how to position my character on my magazine front cover, I took inspiration from the Hobbit edition of Empire magazine. I decided to position the protagonist facing towards the audience with his weapon drawn, in a similar manner to how Bilbo Baggins appears in this magazine front cover. By doing so, I am conforming to the conventions of Empire magazine, as typically, many of the characters on the front cover face towards the audience with some sort of weapon drawn. I believe that this engages the audience much more, as the fact that the character is looking directly at them may draw them into reading or purchasing the magazine. When deciding on the typography for my horror magazine front cover, I decided to use the conventional Empire magazine logo to feature at the top of my front cover. From researching previous issues, I saw how in most cases, the characters who feature on the front covers of the magazine almost always partially cover the Empire logo, for example here, in the X-Men issue. I conformed to this convention, as when creating my magazine cover, I too decided to use this technique when designing the front cover of my horror poster, as I believe it represents the character as being all-powerful, as they are able to dominate much of the front cover of the magazine.